Part 1.
You'll hear two friends planning an event. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Hello, Joan. I'm glad you could come.
Hello, Peter. What's up? Is something the matter?
No, everything's fine.
It sounded urgent on the phone.
Did it? It's just that I've had this idea and I wanted to see how soon we could get it off the ground.
Well, don't keep me in suspense.
You know they're planning to close down the local clinic. It was in the newspaper yesterday, but most people have actually known for some time. Well, I thought we should do something about it.
What did you have in mind?
I thought we could organise a charity event and donate the money to the clinic. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it will show the local council how we feel and that we mean business.
That'll take quite a lot of organising. Why don't we just hold a protest outside the town hall?
A protest would take just as much organisation as an event like this. Besides, I think fewer people would turn up. A village fair or something like that would attract more people and get money for the clinic. People are more generous when they're enjoying themselves.
OK then, it sounds good to me. How do we start?
First, we put our heads together and come up with a list of people who'll be willing to help and people who can provide us with some of the things we need. For example, we might need a caterer to provide refreshments, a rock band for entertainment, tents and so on. Then, we do a lot of telephoning around and try to get everybody together at the same time in the same place.
Sounds like a lot of work to me.
Well, that's only the beginning. First things first, though. Let's decide now on who to get to the initial meeting and where and when to hold it.
Fine. Well, the village hall would be the best place to have the meeting. It's not as big as the youth club, but it's warmer. There'll be no problem getting permission to use it, but I suppose it depends on how many people we invite.
We don't want too many, otherwise the meeting will go on too long and nothing will get decided. But the village hall is a good idea. It's more official than having it in someone's living room. How many? 6 or 8 people to start with? 10 at the most?
OK, now we have to decide on a suitable day and time. Suitable to everybody, I mean. A Saturday or Sunday would seem to be the best choice because people aren't at work on those days. But they may not like the idea of giving up a part of their weekend for a meeting.
Unless we persuade them it's for a good cause, or that it's to their advantage, and that it'll all be a lot of fun. We'll provide refreshments, of course.
What if some don't want to give up their weekend?
Then we'll give them an alternative. Say, one evening in the week after everybody's finished work. We'll see which is the most acceptable to them. Then book the hall.
I can do the refreshments for the meeting. I'll get Darren and Maggie to help me. I'm sure they'll be more than willing.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
So, what's next on the agenda?
A list of who we want at the meeting.
Yes, of course.
Obviously, we want someone from the clinic. I think Dr. Perkins would be best. He can tell us exactly what the financial situation is there. You know, how much money it takes to keep the place running, and how important it is for the community to have the clinic.
The vicar too. He can rally lots of support. And Mr. Sims, our Member of Parliament. He is very busy, but I think I can persuade him to come, or get his wife to persuade him to come. I see her quite a lot socially.
That's great. 2 other people I have in mind are Freddie Smith.
The journalist?
Yes. Well, he's the editor of the local paper now, and might be useful. He might let us advertise for free, and he'll know how to go about getting leaflets and posters printed. That's another thing. We'll need volunteers to put leaflets through people's doors and stick up posters all over the place.
We can decide that at the meeting. What about the other person?
What other person?
You said you had 2 people in mind, Freddie Smith and...
Oh, yes, Mr. Gates.
Mr. Gates. Do I know him?
You must do. He owns Greatfields Farm. We need a large area to hold the fete.
Right. So how many have we got then? 7 or 8? There's Dr. Perkins, Mr. Sims, that journalist...
Freddie Smith, you mean?
Yes, him. And the vicar and Mr. Gates, the farmer. That's only 5.
There's you and me. That's 7. That will do for now. Let's start making phone calls.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear a crime prevention and fire safety officer talking to a group of new residents. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15.
Good evening. Last week, Mr. Jenkins spoke to you about home security. My name is Malcolm Fletcher, and tonight I'm going to talk about personal safety when driving and fire safety in the home. Of course, we shouldn't go around perpetually frightened of all the bad things that might happen to us, but there are some sensible precautions that we should all take to avoid getting hurt. You probably know already that a great number of serious assaults occur in the vicinity of motor vehicles. You should always be alert when walking to your car, and check the rear seat of your car before getting in. This is especially important in isolated parking areas or the far corners of major shopping complexes. Now, once inside your car, get into the habit of locking the doors. Always keep the windows up and the doors locked, especially if you're travelling alone. If at all possible, steer clear of isolated roads after dark. Even with all the high-tech communication devices we have today, many serious crimes are committed on lonely back roads. Make sure your vehicle is mechanically sound, and ensure you have adequate fuel in the tank at all times. If your vehicle does break down in a lonely spot, lift the bonnet and then lock yourself inside the car and call for help on your mobile phone. Never, under any circumstances, leave your vehicle and go with a stranger to seek help, It is better to wait for the police or some other emergency vehicle to stop and offer assistance. Of course, you should never pick up a hitchhiker. Some of the most serious crimes committed in this country have been a direct result of this foolish practice. If you think you're being followed by someone in another vehicle, ideally you should drive to the nearest police station. But if there isn't one within easy reach, drive to the nearest open service station or shop, or the nearest occupied house. Now, we are lucky enough to have a police station in this area. Do any of you know where it is? Look at this map on the screen, and I'll show you how to get to it from the community centre where you are now. Then, when you get home, you can work out how to get there from other directions. From the community centre, go along Bayview Street toward Maiden Avenue. At the roundabout, take the second exit onto Lee Street. Go past the medical clinic, and at the next roundabout, take the first exit onto Moore Street. You should continue on Moore Street until you have passed the little block of shops on the left and the church on the right. Stay on Moore Street until you go over the bridge, and then turn right into Canal Street. You'll find the police station on the corner of Canal Street and Cockleshell Court.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20.
Now let's move on to fire safety. Before I talk to you about safety precautions and procedures, I'd like to mention some of the effects of smoke and heat on humans. There are 4 ingredients of fire, namely oxygen, fuel, heat, and chain reactions. Almost all materials burn, and most household goods burn very easily. The air we breathe contains about 21% oxygen. As fire burns, it consumes oxygen, thereby reducing the oxygen content of the air. When that is reduced to 15%, oxygen deficiencies in body tissue cause an impairment of muscle control and dexterity. At between 10 and 14%, judgment and reasoning are affected. Oxygen reduction to between 6 and 10% results in unconsciousness, and breathing stops. Sounds scary, doesn't it? But that's not all you have to worry about. Many materials in the home give off toxic gases as they burn. The main toxic gases are carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and nitrogen oxide. Carbon monoxide is an invisible and odorless gas produced in all fires. It takes up the place of oxygen in the blood, thereby reducing the supply of oxygen to the brain. The effect of carbon dioxide is to increase the heart rate and stimulate the rate of breathing, causing an increase in the intake of other toxic gases, which contributes to, amongst other symptoms, serious oxygen deprivation. Hydrogen sulfide, on the other hand, affects the nervous system, causing dizziness and pain in the respiratory system. It does occur naturally in volcanic gases and hot springs, and it also results from the bacterial breakdown of organic matter. You're probably familiar with it. You know, it has that characteristic odour of rotten eggs. But make no mistake, in large concentrations, it's deadly. Lastly, nitrogen oxide is another extremely poisonous gas at high levels of concentration, which deadens feeling in the throat and lungs, causes swelling in the throat, and a build-up of fluids in the lungs.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
Part 3.
You will hear two students, Dylan and Emily, discussing a presentation which they will have to make. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24.
Okay, Emily, as you know, we've got to do this presentation together.
I know. I'm a little bit nervous about it. Standing up in front of all those people. And what if the presentation fails? What if...
Don't worry. I've been reading a book about giving effective presentations. It's not that hard, but the way to do it is certainly not always obvious either. For example, do you know what the most important part of a presentation is?
The final summary, I guess.
The opposite. The first minute, in fact. The theory says that first minute is when you win or lose the audience. If you lose them at that point, you'll probably never get them back. So that's why you need a hook.
A hook? You mean like when you catch fish?
Yes. I mean, not exactly, but yes. We want to catch the audience, right? So we need to start in a way which wakes them up, gets them interested, and makes them watch us.
I see.
Basically, no matter how good our presentation is, if the message doesn't get across, the presentation fails. So we need to give a fact which really amazes them, or an interesting story, or pose a dilemma which makes them think, something they can really puzzle over. It's better if this is related to the subject, of course, something to do with management in our case.
So that's the hook?
That's right. From then on, we'll just follow the basic advice.
Like what?
Like, talk to your audience, as equals. Don't talk down to them or up to them. They're just the same as us, right?
You're right, Some of the best presentations I've ever seen sounded just like conversations.
Exactly. And what else made them good?
Well, the speakers sort of involved me in the topic and issues under discussion by asking questions, by referring to me, by saying you, and, well, basically they were interesting.
And they're exactly the tips we'll follow too. It should be fine.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30.
Emily, I think this will be a fine presentation, but how are we going to divide it up? For example, who's going to open it, you or me?
Well, I think you have a very natural style, so you should start. This talk has 5 main parts, so you can introduce it and then do part 1.
That's the historical context or background to the issue.
Yes, then I'll do part 2 about current views. You do part 3 and I'll do part 4, leaving both of us to handle the question time.
I'm okay with that. In part 1, I'll probably speak at length about Hoffman's theory, about management styles, and compare differences in culture in relation to the style of management used.
That sounds good. Those differences are important and certainly relevant to the current times. Hoffman makes some excellent points too on this issue. That's why I'll follow up with present-day perspectives and viewpoints on this, such as the problems facing today's managers in the complex multicultural workplace, where basically one can no longer assume one is dealing with a single culture in the workplace, but actually a multiculture.
That sounds good also. Then I'll take over, discussing the implications and problems of this.
I suppose you'll look at the pluralist movement.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, but then I changed my mind. I've decided I'll look at the productive diversity argument. It's more interesting anyway, so I'll go with that.
Then I'll tell everyone what we've decided is the best business practice, or what is most likely to work in most situations, which is basically ignoring pluralism and productive diversity and linking everything back to Kotter's theory of human universals.
Yes, the theory that argues modern management should target the universals of human nature. Right, and that leaves both of us to field questions at the end.
Are there any questions we can predict so that we have some good answers ready? About resolving industrial disputes, for example?
Well, I'd say that industrial democracy usually surprises people, so we should expect a lot of questions about that.
Yes, the theory is that it increases productivity and reduces industrial delays.
And results in better decision making, but that's all theory. Most people would think that industrial democracy is just about unworkable in practice, so let's be ready to explore that issue in some depth, as well as any other related topics, okay?
Okay.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
You will hear a monologue on the subject of volunteer work in Africa. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Winter, and I'm here to tell you a little about the possibility of volunteer work in Africa. If you're looking for volunteer work in Africa, there are plenty of opportunities available. Let's look at the different types of volunteer opportunities available in Africa, what to expect when volunteering in Africa, and stories from volunteers who have worked in Africa. Volunteering means something different to almost every organisation you come across. Some agencies will cover your flight and cost of living while you are working, and some are true volunteer projects and expect you to cover all costs for the privilege of the experience. If you're looking for a more meaningful way to spend a few months in Africa than simply travelling around, volunteering is a wonderful way to spend your time. Most jobs that last less than a year or so are going to be the ones you have to pay for. Jobs that require a commitment of more than a year will often offer a basic stipend to cover some of your costs. Whether you get paid and how much you get paid will also depend on your skills and how much they're in demand. Most paid volunteer opportunities in Africa are available to those who have a university education and/or a practical skill. Engineers, doctors, nurses, environmentalists, emergency relief personnel, and teachers are among the most asked for by volunteer agencies. If an organisation doesn't require you to have specific skills, then you will usually have to pay your own expenses as a volunteer. In general, most organisations working in Africa try and recruit as many local people as possible, rather than foreigners, since the project should continue long after you have returned home. So don't take it personally if your intention to help people in Africa is rejected. It may just be that a local person is better suited to the job. What should you expect when you volunteer to work in Africa? Conditions are usually basic. Most volunteer opportunities take place in rural areas, where you may not have ready access to running water and electricity. Housing can be very basic, and you will likely be staying with local families. A word about cultural adaptability. As in most countries in the world, rural communities are usually more traditional than urban centres. As you will be working closely with the local population, you will have to dress and behave in accordance with what is acceptable locally. The general pace of life and work is much slower than in the West. Don't expect any organisation to run efficiently and without glitches. Getting sick can be a problem. If you're spending more than just a few weeks in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, your chances of getting malaria or bilharzia will also increase. Make sure you take all the medicine and precautions you need. The organisations you work with should brief you about health issues, and don't forget that local nurses and doctors will have plenty of experience with these common afflictions, probably more than your doctor at home. Initially, you may also have some problems getting used to different food and water. Anyone who has volunteered in Africa will probably tell you that the biggest impact their project had was not on the community but on themselves. Spending time immersed in another culture will change the way you look at life and is part of the appeal of volunteering. Before you decide to volunteer in Africa, you may be interested to learn what the typical experiences are of people already in the field. Later, we'll look at a selection of volunteer stories and experiences from Africa. There are many volunteers and travellers who keep online diaries of their experiences. These contain some excellent tips about working, travelling, and living in Africa. Before that, just a quick word about work permits in Africa. Many people who travel around Africa may wish to stay and work. But just as in Europe or the US, every African country will require you to get an official work permit. In most cases, these laws exist to stop foreigners getting jobs that local people may be qualified for. Unemployment is bad enough throughout Africa, so don't take a job that a local person could do. Now, let's look at a few people's experiences.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.